Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Candidate Donald Trump ran on a campaign that not only questioned many foreign policy orthodoxies, but also lashed out against neoconservative views of the world. Today, the president is surrounded by men in uniform. Some are calling this a soft coup. Cross-talking Trump's generals, I'm joined by my guest, Michael O'Hanlon in Washington. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Also in Washington, we have Thomas Powey. He is an independent economist, policy analyst, and author of From Financial Crisis to Stagnation. And in London, we cross to Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist, writer, and founder of the news website 21stCenturyWire.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Thomas, let me go to you first in Washington. There are a lot of people that would claim, and I think with good credence, that the Trump administration's foreign policy is just a mirror, with different reflections of the foreign policy that we had under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So, Thomas in Washington, how do you see that?
Peter, in short, brief, yes. There's a considerable continuity at this stage. Donald Trump has now signed on for the neocon platform, so that people understand what the neocon view of the world is. It comes out of after the fall of the Soviet Union. A view emerged, it was on the right to begin with, that never again would there be any power that could challenge the United States as had done the Soviet Union. Trump is now on board for that. It's now a bipartisan consensus here. It's more open amongst Republicans, but Democrats are on board. They sort of hide it a little bit with talk of regime change in the name of democratic advance, but that's more cover than substance. You see the Democratic support. Many Democrats voted for the Iraq War. Democrats under Obama and Hillary Clinton were responsible for regime change in Libya. You saw most recently when American warships fired missiles into Syria. Immediately, the Democrats came on board and cheered. This goes quite. There's a history in American political history. It's called the doctrine of American exceptionalism, and that's really where you find this doctrine shaping itself. All right. Let me use to close here. Okay, yeah. let me go to Michael. Hang on here. Let me go to Michael in Washington here to get his take on what my question and what you just said there. Michael, what happened? I mean, during the campaign, we heard very many different things. So, I mean, did Trump cave in? Did he essentially was given some kind of ultimatum, and this is our way or no way? I mean, what do you think the thinking is there? Because I don't think in our lifetime there's been such a stark difference from a candidate to a sitting president in such a short amount of time. Go ahead, Michael in Washington.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I actually agree with your question and with much of what Thomas just said, although I would couch it somewhat differently. I think there is a lot of continuity, and it is partly because of the very generals who are now in important positions that you mentioned in your introduction. I think it does reflect that the United States, like most powers, has interests that actually are more durable and structural than political candidates sometimes like to admit. And I wouldn't put it in quite the same terms as Thomas. I do think that President Trump would like to get along with President Putin, for example, better than Obama or Clinton's instincts might have been. And I think Trump has less of a pro-democracy agenda abroad. He's less interested in nation building or in fomenting democratic movements. And of course, that was a good part of the disagreement between President Putin and Trump's predecessors, whether it was the colored revolutions in the former Soviet space or some of the American actions in the broader Middle East. So I think Trump would like to minimize that, but he still finds himself in a conundrum. He's still got alliances in Korea, in the Middle East, and elsewhere, and he's still got alliances in Europe, and these things create pressures. So I'm not against what he's doing, but I would agree with your point that there's been a big change from him as candidate to him as president, less so a change from Obama to Trump as presidents.
Okay, Patrick, let me get to you. I mean, in a way, I agree with Michael and Thomas, but probably for very different reasons. I mean, I suppose we all agree here the neocons are back with a vengeance, but I don't see why anyone should be happy about that. I see 30 years of absolute, utter failure, and now we have the consensus that this failure is what will continue. I don't get this here, okay? And all of the generals, you know, of the generation that we have right now, I mean, they're all part of that, okay? We don't have to name specific names, but that mindset is there. So, you know, there is continuity. I don't see why anyone should be happy about it. Go ahead, Patrick in London.
Well, if you look at the genealogy of this situation, you go back to the campaign, and Donald Trump wanted to differentiate himself from the field, in the Republican field, and then, of course, with Hillary Clinton. And one of the big knocks from the sort of the conservative and the Tea Party wings in the United States over the last few years was that Obama is weak with the military, and generals were resigning because in protest of Obama, and he's a weak president. So Trump took this talking point up with vigor. And so he positioned himself early. He signaled that I will be deferring all major decisions to the so-called experts, the generals, as he put it. And so by doing that, he sort of disempowered himself very early on by telegraphing that position, which in hindsight, I would say from a leadership point of view is a big mistake. Yeah. Now fast forward into the administration itself. Now the problem of what we have here is not so much about policy, but it's about public perception and expectations. Because if you look at Barack Obama, he took the exact same tact as Donald Trump, marketed himself as a peace president, and that got him elected, and arguably that was one of his strongest qualities in 2008. So Donald Trump just took a line from Obama's playbook, played the exact same line, and look at Obama. He broke every single campaign promise he put up there, from closing Gitmo to drawing down troops from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay, let me go to Thomas here. I mean, in a way, we're all kind of agreeing here. I mean, is it the power of these institutions in the security apparatus and the Defense Department? I mean, are they just so strong that there's no such thing that a candidate can change that, cannot change the course of the ship, as it were? Go ahead, Thomas.
Peter, there are several factors involved in Trump's about turn. The first thing is one should be cautious about reading too much into his statements before the election. He was he had no experience in Washington. He was running as an outsider, so he could say outsiderish things without cost and actually with benefit. Then he becomes president, and when you arrive in Washington, the pressures are absolutely tremendous to conform. There are so many powerful interests around the president to make him conform. I also think, by the way, that Trump's inclination is neocon. That's who he is. He's a bit of a bully. Neocon doctrine is aggressive and simplistic, and that's going to appeal to him. So in some ways, it's a natural resting point for him. Now, on top of that, once the Democrats made this decision to make Russia the focal point of their loss, to try and their awful failure and sort of shift the blame to Russia, then that began to put more pressure on Trump in two ways. First, it began to uncover his dealings with the Russians in the past, both his real estate dealings, where real estate is about the most corrupt business there is, except for garbage collection. And then also it began to uncover the dealings of Flynn and Donald Jr. with the Russians, where I think actually the Russians rather entrapped Trump with the promise of some dirt on Hillary Clinton that probably didn't exist.
What did that have to do with the election? What did any of that have to do with the election? Except for a conspiracy theory. Go ahead, please do.
Let's not get into that. Let's not get into that question.
I didn't either. I didn't want to.
Once that became once that became the focal point of the Democrats' attack on Trump, then that opened the door for the neocons to put pressure on Trump. And then what does Trump do? Trump has a tremendous wonderful political intuition that people underestimate him on. The neocons and the Democrats are coming after him, so he's going to out-neocon the neocon by embracing them and being even more neocon. So it's in part for him, it's a tactical adjustment.
That's a very interesting
everyone
theory.
Gets their own way. This is the way
it's a very interesting
This is the way he defends himself, and this is the way the neocons take over the administration.
All right, Michael in Washington, I think it's unprecedented we have a president that has so many former military staff, generals in service and retired. I mean, doesn't that create a different mindset about looking at security and military policy when inside the White House and not the Pentagon? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Just one quick point, though, on this neocon issue. And as you know, even though I agree with much of what's being said, I'm a little more sympathetic to the fact that President Trump has wound up in these more traditional positions. I probably agree with them more, and maybe that explains it. But I think when you look at the options that he had, when you look at the options that he really had on Afghanistan or North Korea or what have you, it wasn't necessarily a neocon desire to remake the world in an American image or a more democratic image. It was because he didn't see good options. He didn't see other ways to break out of the mainstream thinking. Yeah, we can debate whether he should have. But I think it's a little different.
But don't you think it's neocon ideas that got us in these messes in the first place? I mean, I think that needs to be discussed as well.
In some cases.
Okay, all right. All right, keep going, Michael. We have 1 minute
before
we got...
In some cases, that's true.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, keep going.
But yes, on the generals, one good thing about this group of generals, and I know them all and I like them all, they have all through the mess of the Middle East of the last 15 years. They have learned firsthand, if we didn't know it before, the limitations of applying military power. I don't think any of them would say that they're happy about what the last 15 years have brought us in the broader Middle East or the sacrifice that we've had to undertake as a result of our own decisions. So I think you're going to see a little bit more strategic savvy and reluctance to use force out of this group of generals, and that gives me some encouragement.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Trump and his generals. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing Trump and his generals. Okay, let's go back to Patrick in London. I had a great question I was going to ask you, but I think at the end of the first segment you gave such an expression that I think I'll just give you the floor. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, you know, I've got a problem with this deference to the generals, for instance. You know, you look at the resumes of all of these so-called generals, war heroes, or what have you, the David Petraeus of the world. The resume is chock full of failures, scandals, and otherwise international embarrassment, some of the biggest foreign policy failures in U.S. history. So there's nothing to celebrate there. Afghanistan is not a success. It never made sense from the beginning, and it still doesn't make sense now. Ditto with Iraq. You have all these sages who did the surge, for instance. So it's just to put any too much patting on the back of the military, I think it's a problem in this discussion. The real problem is the United States has no foreign policy. And to say that the United States ever had any interests, if you want to talk about national security interests, there are none. The U.S. has corporate interests, defense industry interests, and the interest of Israel in regards to the so-called neoconservative agenda in the Middle East. It's an Israeli-led agenda, and this is a president that is very chummy with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's appointed his son-in-law as a Middle East envoy, who's a property developer and a website owner and otherwise small tycoon from Manhattan. I mean, what is this? This is a complete disaster in terms of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy. It's a problem that's ticking time bomb potentially diplomatically. No leadership. The generals or whoever, the Pentagon is running various aspects of U.S. foreign policy. And meanwhile, half of Washington doesn't seem to have gotten a memo that we lost in Syria. That Syria was not a civil war. Syria was a proxy war. We spent billions of dollars. We flooded the region with weapons. People's heads should be on a chopping block in a legal sense for that. And no one's talking about this and blaming Russia for various other things.
We're talking about it, and I think a good part of media should be on the same chopping block. Thomas, let me go back to you. I want to just reiterate something. I'm very conservative because it seems to me that, and I'm going to be objective here and fair. I mean, military people have, they see things and then they create objectives, but that's a very narrow way of thinking about things. And I worry that, you know, having so many generals, you know, surrounding the president, that they will have a different way to deal with problems. And usually, you know, in a conflict, they don't have to worry about what happens next. I mean, these guys have any experience in that? You know, this is what I find very troublesome, because in the military you have objectives, not necessarily policy. Go ahead, Thomas.
Peter, let me say there are several things to be said. First, with regard to Patrick, I agree with the details of his description, but those elements about being corporate interest, Israeli interest, defense interests, national interest is always defined in terms of the dominant interest, and that is the dominant interest today. And that's something we in the United States need to recognize. That's our debate about what should be our national interest. Now the next thing, we do understand why the generals are in charge. And there's a reason for it. The Trump White House has been chaotic, and it hasn't been working, and this has been a real fear for the establishment, to have a sort of a loose cannon like Trump running around, and this is the way that the establishment gets in there through generals who have a real sense of mission, loyalty to institution. These are talented, educated men, and this is the way to put some walls around that loose cannon. Now, the next thing is then, what does that do to U.S. policy? Does it become more militaristic? And that's actually quite a complicated question. And I put three little pots on the table. The first is you have to look at existing conflicts. Generals do not do a good job at cutting their losses. Westmoreland wanted to stay in Vietnam. The American military is just oversupplied with resources. They will not cut their losses and run because we give them too much. Well, not run's the wrong word. Cut the losses and leave sensibly because we give them too much resources. So that's bad. That's why we're staying in Afghanistan. That's the advice that won out with Obama, and that's going to continue with Trump. Now, the next pot is new conflicts. There I do think the military, these generals do a good job. They're very careful about getting into new conflicts. They are concerned about the men and women that they command. They don't want to be the cause of death. They want an exit strategy. They want to know that it's for a purpose. So I think that, at least in the past, the American military was reserved about getting into new conflicts. Now I have two reservations. I think that is changing for two reasons. One reason is that the whole country has become more nationalistic and more neoconservative. That's the dominant way of thinking of it. Our generals are drawn from our population, and they therefore
Thomas,
reflect that.
I don't think that's true. And I think there is evidence. There is evidence. Let me go to Michael. I need equal time for everyone here. Let me go to Michael here.
Okay, go for it.
One of the reasons why I wanted to do this program is that people that have been watching this program knew that I was anyone but Hillary. I made that very clear, and I was very skeptical about Donald Trump, but I did like what he had to say about foreign policy, about talking about these orthodoxies, which I think need to evolve or come to an end. And I disagree with what Thomas just said here. I think the country is tired of these wars, these senseless, wasteful wars that really damage America's image in the world. I know, I live abroad. I feel it all of the time. America isn't neocon. America wants to end this agenda, and you know what? They're getting the short end of the stick again. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I do agree with you, Peter, that neocon is not quite the right way to describe the national mood. Although I thought Thomas's analysis was excellent.
Well, I agree.
About the tendencies of generals not to want to lose. On which wars they tend to want to win and which wars they want to stay out of. That was a very useful distinction, which I appreciate. In terms of the national mood, and just to go along with your point, Peter, if we look at the Middle East and build on Patrick's concern about our relationship with Israel, I have some concerns about our relationships under President Trump with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, because I don't think he cares very much about the human rights agenda or the democracy agenda. He's willing to essentially tolerate their internal policies because they are loyal allies. And now we know that there is some utility to not getting overly obsessed with a pro-human rights, pro-democracy agenda. That's where neoconservative thinking can go too far. But I'm concerned that Trump is actually falling back on a pure realist approach to the world. And in regard to Saudi Arabia and Egypt, I don't much like it. So I think there's a lot of nuance here as to what's driving Trump and what his worldview is. I would not describe it as neocon. I would describe it as more realist. Okay,
Patrick, what's wrong with a realist foreign policy? We haven't tried it for a while, have we? What's wrong with that? Okay, and I'm going to say, that we should have concerns about human rights and these soft issues as well. They shouldn't be completely dismissed. But a realist foreign policy identifies your real interests, and then you can pursue how to protect them. Go ahead, Patrick.
There's nothing wrong with a realist foreign policy. Any reasonable, sane person would agree with that. But unfortunately, those people who inhabit the Beltway are not reasonable and, on the whole, not sane. Our relationship and our policy with Saudi Arabia has nothing to do with human rights. Sure. Never has, never will. Saudi Arabia is a great client for our military defense contractors. Bumper year, great arms sales by one of the greatest arms sellers in history, Barack Obama. Continuing with Trump, he's doing the same thing with the signaling to South Korea to open up the sort of the spending modules there. So the reality is continuity as change. And so look at our defense budget, up 20%. So 600 billion to 700 billion. That is what matters in the United States in terms of foreign policy. It's how much money is being spent on defense. Russia's defense budget, what is it, 80 billion? Yeah. We just upped our defense budget by more than the totality of the Russian defense budget, and there's, still pushing these conspiracy theories in Washington that Russia is somehow a global threat to, hegemony of the world order and so forth. So it's kind of ridiculous to even suggest that human rights plays any part in any of this. It didn't in Libya. They lied all the way to get the UN resolution in Libya based on fraudulent claims of human rights violations by Susan Rice and many others. They did the same thing in Syria by spinning up a whole program of lies about barrel bombs and Assad butchering his own people and all this other stuff, and moderate rebels. And so all these people in Washington who profit off this, whether they're in think tanks, whether they work for the defense industry, whether they're lobbyists for the defense industry, or whether they're congressmen or senators cashing checks from those industries, those are the people that keep pushing this unrealistic foreign policy, Patrick, or unrealistic worldview.
We're rapidly running out of time. Thomas, if I go back to you in Washington, I have a quick theory for you to analyze here. The Democrats and the media don't want to see Trump accomplish anything, and then in the terms of foreign policy, sway him into more of a neocon position, and that will alienate his base. That essentially neuters him on both sides. What do you think?
That's too broad for me to have an opinion. It's clear that they should not.
This is TV.
They shouldn't
I'm
want
sorry,
Trump to
Thomas.
succeed.
This is TV. Okay, I'm sorry. It's TV. Go ahead.
I'm just not used to that. Obviously they shouldn't want Trump to succeed. The more successful he is, the less successful they will be. Though I think the Democrats are behind this, in cahoots with this neocon agenda. They've bought into it. I am very apprehensive about this democracy test that Michael was talking about. Democracy is just such a difficult flower to make flourish. It needs a history, a preparation, and we have to draw back from that, because it then becomes cover that smells good for neocon engagement with the world. So I'm very much for drawing back from
it only smells good in Washington, okay? Because people like that smell, okay? and then it gets detached from reality here. 1 minute, Michael, in Washington. The same question. My little theory there, made for television. Go ahead, my friend. 1 minute.
Well, my hope, Peter, is that President Trump will be able to develop this relationship with Russia that I think he clearly wants, which does distinguish him from his predecessors, or at least at the end of their terms, and I think distinguishes him from neocons. He wants to be a little bit more pragmatic. I've just finished a book, Beyond NATO, proposing a neutral zone in Eastern Europe that I would hope President Trump and President Putin
I will buy your book. I will buy your book, okay? Because we're getting a little bit closer over the years. We're getting a little bit closer over the years.
Yes.
Finish up. Go ahead, Michael.
And thank you. And that's the kind of idea that I'd like to see people be able to consider and get beyond some of the histrionics and disagreements of past years. We've got to find a way for the world's two great nuclear superpowers to repair their relationship. And I agree with Trump on that basic sentiment. So I hope that all the other issues don't forever contaminate any opportunity.
We've run out of time here, and remarkably, we ended on a realist note. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.